Good afternoon, folks. This is the Washington chapter of the Society for Range Management, and I'm Tom Platt. This is the first quarterly webinar for 2024. Today's topic is plants poisonous to livestock, and the presenter is Dr. Clint Stonecipher. Dr. Stonecipher is a range scientist with the USDA Poisonous Plant Research Laboratory in Logan, Utah. And during the presentation, and perhaps in printed material that you read afterwards, they use that acronym PPRL for the Poisonous Plant Research Lab. Dr. Stonecipher's research focuses on solutions to improve rangelands and mitigate the harmful effects of toxic plants. Clint was this year's recipient of SRM's Outstanding Achievement Award for Research. And today he's going to discuss current research being conducted at the Poisonous Plant Research Center, some conducted by other researchers and some of his own. And he's currently engaged in research in the Pacific Northwest at this time. So Clint, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'll turn the webinar over to you.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen here. Wants to work.
Should be down at the bottom, little green box.
Yeah.
There we go.
Is that showing the presentation for you? Or?
It's in a presentation mode. So we need to, well, I guess it's maybe not. It's in some kind of a review mode.
Okay. Let's see. It's switching it to one of my other screens.
Maybe just slideshow up at the top. And we did this so well yesterday.
I know. It's usually how it works, isn't it? See if I can change my screen here. Is that working better? Can you see it there?
And that's fine, Clint. It's only about half the screen because we're seeing, what's coming up next in your notes.
Okay.
So somebody who's a PowerPoint user ought to be able to give us some advice here. Let's see. There we go. Try that. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, so let's keep this pretty informal. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask at any time. And then I wanted to bring up next year, the annual SRM meeting is going to be held in Spokane next February. And so I was just wondering if anybody on this presentation had any ideas of what we're thinking about doing a poisonous plant symposium. And if anybody had any ideas on topics they would like to see covered, we'd be interested to hear about that. So I just want to talk about the lab, some of the research we're doing, some of the plants that are most toxic that we deal with a lot. And so the lab's located in Logan, Utah, kind of central to the Western US. We go all over the Western US to do research, collect plants, consult on poisonings. So kind of the mission of our lab, we try to identify plants that are toxic to livestock, determine the toxins in those plants, and then kind of come up with management solutions to help reduce losses to livestock from the poisonous plants. So we kind of approach this on what we call an interdisciplinary approach. So we have a number of different scientists at the lab with all different backgrounds. We have a veterinary pathologist, we have a toxicologist, we have a pharmacologist, an animal scientist, a biochemist, a chemist, and then we have a plant physiologist, and then I'm the range scientist. And so we kind of look at these poisonings from plants from all different aspects and try to come up with these core solutions to reduce losses. And so there's a number of different losses, and we kind of break this into direct and indirect. And direct is pretty easy to distinguish, easy to see a death loss, maybe impaired weight gains, abortions, or birth defects. But there are also some indirect losses. And a lot of times this comes, with the increased vet costs. Maybe you have to call a vet out to help even diagnose the problem. Or maybe you had a cow that aborted, and so now you have to deal with retained placenta or other things like that. So increase your vet costs. Poisonous plants increase your risk of animal loss. And then maybe you have to change your management style. Maybe you have to hire a herder to keep animals out of a certain location, or maybe you have to fence off an area. So there's a lot of different costs associated with plants, and it costs the livestock industry a lot of money each year, millions of dollars. So when we talk about poisonous plants, it all comes down to the dose. The dose makes the poison. And so you think about this maybe through, if you have a headache and you take aspirin, you take a couple aspirin to help cure that headache. But if you take a handful of aspirin, that's probably going to make you ill, not feel well. Or if you take the whole bottle, you're probably going to be in the hospital having your stomach pumped, or even something worse. So, all drugs and medicines are poisons. It just comes down to the dose. And so at our lab, we kind of do different experiments. And some of these, we do use animals. So we have the facility to keep goats, sheep, and cattle to do research on. Some of these plants only may affect one species. Some plants affect all species. So we need to kind of do the research to kind of determine that and see how it affects the different animals. We're also set up at the lab to do rodent experiments. Some of these toxins are take too much of an effort to get enough to do in a large animal. So if we have some small ruminant models or small rodent models, it makes it a lot easier. And then we also go out all through the West and we do grazing studies. Sometimes we're lucky to be up in the mountains where it's pretty nice. Here was a larkspur study, but sometimes we've been over in South Dakota when it's 20 below in the middle of the winter doing studies. Been where it's 100+ degrees doing studies. So we do go all over, and we do go in different locations and different environments to do these studies. So our lab has developed an app to kind of, it takes what we had as a bulletin 415, and we've taken that bulletin and put it into an app form. So it has all the plants that we do research on and work with. And so if you kind of look in the center here, if you downloaded the app and you can use the QR code here, either an Android phone or an Apple phone, if you're interested in downloading it, or you can go to the App Store and search PPRL and it'll come up. But you can search through different plants. So say maybe you just had an interest in larkspur, you could scroll over and you could find larkspur and then look it up and see the information we have on it. But it's also set up where you can do this advanced search. And so maybe you had some cattle that maybe had aborted. So you could put in cattle. It's got some drop down windows. So you could put in cattle and then put aborted as one of the symptoms. And then it could do a search. It has other options too, time of year or plant community that it's associated with, but you don't have to put all that information in. And so you could do the advanced search and it'll show the plants that we have that are associated with causing abortions. And then there's also on the bottom of the app, there's some ways to contact us. If you have a poisoning and would be interested in us to get back with you, you could do that. Or we have a website. There's a link to the website or a link to a phone number to call us. So I just kind of want to go through some plants that are big problems here in the Western US and kind of talk about them and some of the research we've done. And larkspur's one of those plants that's been a big problem for a long time. And it seems the more research we do, the more complex this whole issue becomes. And there's a lot of plant factors and animal factors that are involved that make this such a complex issue. So tall larkspurs, they're usually found up in high mountain elevation sites, typically areas that are snow covered during the winter. And they tend to grow in forb dominated sites. So very nutritious forage is associated with these tall larkspur sites. So there's high carrying capacity potential. And if you have larkspur that's there and you're avoiding the larkspur, you're losing out on a lot of high quality forage. So some of the toxins that are associated with larkspur are alkaloids, and there's two major kinds. One's an MSAL, which is very toxic, and then there's an MDL, and it's not very toxic. So this MLA is a MSAL type alkaloid, and it's usually the one we look for in larkspurs to determine the toxicity. And you can see the lethal dose, the LD50 in mice is just 4.5 milligrams per kilogram. But this MSAL type, the delta line, the MDL type, the delta line is 110 milligrams. So there's a big difference. So not all larkspurs are created equal, and not all of them have the same chemical profile. And so here's kind of an example of that. And these are two different chemotypes, and they're of one plant species, a Delphinium occidentale, which is one of the tall larkspurs. There's numerous tall larkspurs. So these were collected at two locations, and you can see the one chemotype A has the MLA, which is the toxic compound, and chemotype B has no MLA, but they both have the delta line, the compound that's less toxic.
So Clint, is that typical that you'll find would all the plants in one location be toxic and another perhaps not, or would they be mixed?
Yeah, it's so you can kind of see here on this map, this distribution map. So we have the chemotype A, which contained the MLA, which was very toxic, and you can see its distribution. If it's found in one location, it's kind of the dominant plant. But you can see over in Colorado, southern Wyoming, some of Utah, we have the chemotype B, which is not as toxic. But that doesn't mean you don't have the risk of toxicity from larkspur, because especially here in central Utah, there's another tall larkspur, the Delphinium barbii, that's present, and it has a lot of MLA in it, so it's very toxic. So you might have one, you might have both. You can see here, there's a mixture kind of in Wyoming, Idaho, there's a mixture of both chemotypes within areas. So yeah, it just kind of helps add to the complexity of this whole larkspur issue.
And what's the palatability? How would you evaluate that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna get into that right now. And that's a good question. So if you kind of look here on this graph, it shows the change in toxicity over the season. So we have alkaloid concentration here on the left, and you can kind of see, let's follow this reproductive plant parts. So it's plant parts that were collected at different phenological stages and just depended on the stage of development, what reproductive part was collected, whether it was a bud, a flower, or a seed pod. And you can see it decreases over the season. But here you have this little bump that occurs. And so what's happening here? And that's where the seed pods are developing. So your seeds are developing in the pods. So that's just the plant is trying to pass on the toxicity to the next generation. And so when we talk about toxicity risk and palatability of the plant, so you can see this toxicity, it kind of follows that reproductive parts, declines over the season, have a little bump when the seed pods come on. But here we have palatability over time. And you can see early on, palatability is pretty low. And so what we think is there's a lot of alkaloids in that plant early on in the season. So it's probably pretty bitter, not very palatable. But as the season goes on, it increases in palatability. So early on, it's usually pretty low risk because the animals won't graze it. And then late in the fall, the risk is low also, even though your palatability high, your toxicity's low. So once those seed pods develop and the seeds develop and those seed pods open up and shatter and lose the seed, the toxicity decreases really rapidly. So really, if you look here, when plants, if you see larkspur out in the forest and it has the blue flowers on it, you probably want to avoid grazing it. It's usually when it's had that flower to green pod stage is when it's the most toxic. And that's when it's most palatable too. Cows really like to start eating it right after the bud stage. And sometimes they'll even start eating the buds, but usually when it's starting to flower. So that's when it's most palatable. And so kind of switching from the plant and looking at the animal aspects. So we've done some research at the lab and we've done some exercise protocols after we dose some animals. So we'll dose them and then 24 hours later, we'll do an exercise protocol and we'll see how long they'll walk and we'll give them up to 40 minutes. And usually if they walk to 40 minutes, we pretty much say they're pretty resistant to the larkspur. But you can see there's some animals that never even make it out of the corral. So they're pretty susceptible. And so you can see there's a difference in breeds of animal. So Angus, they'll average about 15 minutes of walk time. But the line one Herefords we've tested, they're less than 10-minute walk time. But some of the dairy breeds, the Holstein and Jersey, they're up over 25 minutes. So they're a lot more resistant to larkspur toxicity. And then the Brahmas are pretty much like the line one Herefords. They're pretty susceptible to toxicity. So there's a difference among breeds, but there's also a difference within breeds. And so you can see the Angus that we've tested, there's a group of animals that are highly susceptible to larkspur poisoning and a set that are pretty resistant to it. And then everything that falls in between. So there's not only a difference among breeds, but even within breeds that helps complicate this whole issue. And so also we've looked at differences in sexes. So heifers versus steers and bulls. And you can see most of the heifers, they don't even make it out of the corral. The walk time is less than 5 minutes on average, but most of them are pretty susceptible to it. And then the steers and bulls, they're about the same. They're over 15-minute walk time. So they're a little more resistant to larkspur toxicosis. And then also there's a difference in age of animals. So we took a group of yearling steers and we gave them a dose. And you can see they made it about a little over 15 minutes walk time on average. So we kept those same animals, and a year later, we gave them that same dose, and you see all of them walked to 40 minutes. So none of them were poisoned on larkspur. So we took that same group of animals, and we increased the larkspur dose, 2 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which is a pretty good increase in dose. And you can see that they were still susceptible to larkspur, but it took a lot more of the plant material to poison them. So it looks like animals, as they get older, they'll be able to eat a little more larkspur and have less of a risk of being poisoned. So then we looked at we did a research project where we looked at native versus naive animals. And so what I'm calling native animals are animals that grew up on a ranch that has larkspur. So as calves, their mom grazed on larkspur rangelands. Their mothers have been exposed to larkspur, their grandmothers have been exposed to larkspur. And then naive cattle, they've never been exposed, and then their mothers haven't been exposed, nor have their grandmothers. And so we just kind of did some bite counts on these animals, and you see they like the grass early on, and grass decreased over the season, and their forage consumption increased. But if you look at their larkspur consumption in 2022, you can see you have these naive animals that tended to eat more larkspur than the native animals. But we did see a lot more of the native animals show signs of intoxication. So they had the wheat trembling, might have went down out in the pasture versus the naive animals. So we repeated it the next summer, and same consumption pattern on grasses and forbs. They ate the grasses early on and then switched to forbs later in the season. But if you look here, you can see the native animals tended to like the larkspur a little more that second year. So they consume more larkspur. And we still had the native animals showing more signs of intoxication that second year. So overall, no, there really wasn't a difference. And so, yeah, they just kind of adds to complexity. And so what we were hoping to find in all this research is, could we find a genetic marker that we could test for that, maybe we could take a blood sample of a herd and then find animals within that herd that may be resistant to larkspur or really susceptible. And it's a lot more complicated issue than just finding one little gene that'll kind of tell us the difference. So really it didn't work out. And this took 10 plus years of research just to get to that point. So I'm going to switch to lupins a little bit. And lupins are another one of those that's pretty complex, and there's big differences in chemistry of the plant and how it affects the animals. We usually see sheep poisoned on it most often, more than cattle. Cattle can be poisoned. And it's usually when they're eating the lupin seeds and the green pods. They usually kind of like the larkspur. They're passing that on to the next generation, so the seeds are pretty high in the alkaloids. And then usually with cattle, we see what we call, with these birth defects, which we call crooked calf syndrome. And so crooked calf syndrome kind of occurs during 40 to 100 days of gestation. So when that calf's developing during that period of gestation. And a couple of the alkaloids that are involved in that are the anagyrine and the amidendrine. The anagyrine's usually the biggest problem. But you can see sometimes there's a cleft palate that develops. So the palate on the roof of the mouth doesn't close. And that usually occurs between 40 to 50 days of gestation. And then sometimes you see other development problems like crooked limbs, crooked back, crooked neck. And that usually happens between 50 to 100 days of gestation, just depending on what stage of development the calf is. And so this has been a big problem in the past up in eastern Washington, kind of on that Channel Scaplands region. And then you kind of see like this calf, he just has it all bad. He's got a crooked leg here, his neck's crooked, his back, his hips, the back legs. And so the way this neck is formed on this calf, he's probably can't get his head up to nurse mom. So he's probably been a bottle fed calf to keep alive. And so it would be pretty hard to keep an animal like that alive. And so kind of the mechanism of action with this is the lack of fetal movement. So the lupin kind of causes the fetus to stop moving. And just depending on what stage of development is the deformity you get. And you can see this this little fella, his back was curled up. And so you can see that when he was born. And so there's another number of different development issues. So it could be these crooked legs, a crooked back, a crooked neck. And so you can see it would be hard for a calf like these to follow mom out through the rangeland. Um, it would be hard to market these animals for sale. So it's pretty much just personal use. And then, so not all lupin species contain these teratogenic alkaloids. Some of them contain alkaloids that are toxic to sheep and also cows. So just consuming them could kill the animal. But some of them do cause these crooked calf syndrome. And so our plant physiologist kind of looked at the Lupinus sulphureus, which is the yellow lupin, and kind of did some collections up in northeastern Oregon up through Washington. And you can see he's got different chemical profiles for each of these different collections that are all a sulphureus species, so all the yellow lupin, but the chemical makeup is not the same in all these. So some of them contain anagyrine, some contained amidendrine, some contain a mix, and some didn't have any at all. So it just kind of complicates the whole issue with the lupin, along with like what we saw with the larkspur. And then we've kind of worked on developing some different matrices to help diagnose some of these poisons. A lot of times we'll ask for rumen sample so we can look for the alkaloids of interest, but not a lot of people like to collect a rumen sample from a dead animal. So we've kind of looked at looking at hair and also earwax. And so we've done some research projects with looking at the anagyrine in the lupin. And you can see we can detect it in the earwax after we dosed animals. And you can detect it in hair over time also. But we've done some projects with some producers, and one of them we've done recently is we had a producer up in kind of central eastern Idaho where he's had problems, and he has two different lupin species, and one of them has anagyrine in it and the other has amidendrine, and the one with amidendrine grows lower on his elevation, his mountain range land, and the one with the anagyrine grows up higher. And so we collected earwax on some of the animals he had grazing those pastures and kind of looked at, can we tell a difference in what these animals like, which lupin species they're grazing? And we can distinguish between the two species. A lot of them preferred the Leucophilus, which had the anagyrine, over the Sericius, which had the amidendrine. But it was a little more difficult to correlate which animals that had the crooked calf to which plant sample they ate. So that's a little harder to do. So I'll switch and kind of go over death camas a little bit. Death camas is usually a big problem with sheep. And so you can see all these white spots all through this pasture. Those are all sheep that have died from eating death camas. So death camas is a perennial forb, comes back from a bulb each year. If you were to dig this plant up, there would be a bulb down at the bottom of it. Death camas usually starts growing early in the spring. It grows pretty rapidly, so by midsummer it's usually gone and you don't even know it's there anymore. It has these V-like shape leaves, but you can see here's a smaller death camas plant that hasn't flowered yet, and sometimes they can be pretty hard to distinguish between the grasses, especially early on. They are toxic to cattle and sheep, but most of our losses we see are with sheep. and it is a cardiovascular toxin. And it's the problem early in the spring because that's when it grows. It usually starts growing, as your snow is starting to melt off, can come up through the snow banks, and then flowers pretty quick. And then once it flowers, goes the seed pod, then it desiccates pretty early on. By middle of June, middle of July, somewhere in there, it's usually gone and not a problem anymore. It has been mistaken in the past for wild onion or camas lily. So we do get cases that reported to us every now and then of people that have been poisoned from death camas. This was a case that occurred about 7 or 8 years ago here in northern Utah, up in the mountains. And so kind of what we think happened here is the producer gathered his sheep up one afternoon, put them in the corral, kind of held them in the corral overnight. They pretty much ate everything in that corral within the first couple hours they were in the corral. So they didn't eat all night. The next morning, the semis come in, loaded the sheep on, and then they trucked them out of the West Desert, out up onto the mountain range land. So they dropped them out on the roadway, and then they kind of climbed up this mountain. And all through the mountainside, there was death camas. There's also some lupin species that were here. Down on the lower elevation, there were some plants that had cardioglycosides that are also toxic. So there were a number of different species, but we pretty much think it was the death camas. And you can see before they made it to the top of the hill, animals were starting to die. And this was just right up at the top. So it killed the animals pretty quick. And so what we think happened is these animals were pretty hungry. So they're not as selective in what they eat. They're just looking for something green and palatable. So they tend to eat a lot of death camas early on like that. And that's usually a lot of the cases of death camas poisoning we see, how that occurs. And so we did a little herbicide research project, kind of see some of the herbicides that might control it. Some of the old research shows that 2,4-D was really the only thing that's control death camas. And it usually, that research said it was only effective when the plants were in the early growth stages. So we looked at 6 different herbicides. We applied at 2 different application timings. So we applied a set of death camas plants early, so what we call early vegetative growth, and then at a late stage, which all the plants were flowering. And so we did this at 2 locations, one in northern Utah, which is a mountain big sagebrush plant community, and then we did it also in central Utah, and we had a pinyon Utah juniper plant community. And so these are the herbicides we used. And so we did throw in the 2,4-D, and then we had another herbicide that had 2,4-D plus triclopyr. And then each herbicide had a non-ionic surfactant combined with it. And so here's this graph here. If you look to the left of these dashed line here, these were the plants that were treated early on, so the early treatment, so they were early vegetative growth, and then the late treatment, all these plants were treated when they were flowering. So we just look at percent control, and so here's our untreated plant plots, didn't receive any herbicide, and you can see we did have some natural loss, and so this is at our south site. And so you can see there's 3 herbicides, the Milestone, the Telar, the Facedil. They really didn't do anything. It's pretty much similar to what the control plots were, and both late and early. But we did have some pretty good luck with the 2,4-D, and we did have even good luck with it late when the plants were late or that flower stage, which previous research said they didn't work. And then we had some pretty good luck with Plateau, and then the Crossbow, which remember had the 2,4-D combined with the triclopyr. And so look at the north side. Here's our control. Same herbicides showed the same effect efficacy as the untreated control plots. And then same with the herbicides that did control the death camas. Had pretty good luck. And we had actually had some better control at the north site with these herbicides, a little closer to 100%. And that might be there was a little more moisture up in that site, so probably helped a little bit with uptake of the herbicide. So here's some pictures of that. So you can see here's the 2,4-D plots, and you can see the crossbow plots. You know, you can see the damage. So this was herbicides that were applied at the early vegetative stage. And then we went back about 10 days later and we looked at the plots and we collected plants for chemistry analysis. So this is about 10 days after treatment, but you can see the plateau. It doesn't look like there was any damage to these plants at all. And so the graphs I showed you before, they were all 1 year after treatment. So we went back 1 year after we treated the plants, and we counted the plants within the plots, and that's how we got our control. And so you can see if you looked at this, maybe if you're leasing this property from a landowner and you come in, bring sheep in, but what if he's treated this with plateau this spring before you brought your sheep in? You probably wouldn't even know it. So would that be an issue? Would it be a concern? And so some of the herbicides, they can change or alter toxicity of poisonous plants. You can see larkspur has the alkaloids have been increased from herbicide application. There's some which show a decrease in toxin concentration due to herbicide, and then some there's no effect at all. So what about palatability? Will this affect palatability at all? And some of the herbicides, and this is not just on poisonous plants, but just on other plants, and research has shown that you can preserve your crude protein content. Some herbicides will preserve digestibility, and some will reduce the loss of water-soluble carbohydrates, so which will increase the palatability of the plant. And so we wanted to know, are these herbicides changing the toxicity of the plant? And so we collected plants that about 10 days after treatment, both early and late. And zygozine's the main component in death camas that we look for. There's zygozinine also that's in lower concentrations, but zygozine's usually the one we look for when we look at toxicity of death camas. And you can see here the plants that didn't receive any herbicide, a number of these herbicides didn't change at all. You had a couple like milestone tellard that decreased, but these herbicides, remember, they didn't control the plant, so you wouldn't even be wasting your money to apply those herbicides. But look what the plateau did. It increased the zygazine concentration, both early vegetative and in the flower stage. So if you were to go in and graze that after it had been treated with plateau, it would take fewer plants for an animal to graze for them to become poisoned on that. So if that plateau increased the palatability at all, those animals might be grazing more of that plant, and it could be a big problem. So with this, we just like to say, if you do treat plants, any poisonous plant with herbicide, we just recommend that you don't graze it that year, or at least wait till the plant is senesced, dried up, and kind of is no longer present. Because even some of these plants that, even though they might be dried up and wilted away, if they're still there, they can still be toxic. So another issue we see is pine needle abortion. And usually what happens is animals kind of get pushed under the pine trees during a storm or something and cause them to eat these green needles. But even the dry needles that are on the ground, they're still toxic. So ponderosa pines, the one that has the toxins in it that are a problem, and it's isocupressic acid, which we call ICA. Also has some labdane acids in it that cause problems. Some of your junipers also contain these compounds and will cause abortion. Um, these compounds in the junipers can be found in the leaves and also in the bark. So it's usually associated what we call late term abortion. So cows are usually mid to late second trimester into their third trimester. And so what happens is these compounds in the pine trees, they tend to reduce blood flow to the fetus, and so ends up inducing abortion. And usually what happens is if it does happen, a lot of these cows end up with retained placenta. So increases your vet costs there. You hope you can get them treated and cleaned out before breeding season so they'll breed the next year, but not always the case. And we usually see it, like I said, a storm blows these animals, blows in and pushes these animals up under the pine trees looking for shelter. And some of the research we've done shows that thinner animals will eat more pine needles than the fatter animals. So try to keep your animals in good body condition score during the winter. And another plant just recently we've kind of come across that's a big problem is the Salvia reflexa, also called lanceleaf sage. So here's just some of it growing that we grew in the greenhouse to look at. All the plant parts are toxic leaves, but really these seed pods and the calyx even stay after the seed pods have opened and lost the seed. These calyx stay toxic also. And so usually what happens is, from what we've seen, a new seeding of alfalfa, that first cutting is usually the biggest problem. And so you have producers that are baling up this hay, and then you get it contaminated with the salvia, and you can see it kind of growing out through the hay field, some on the side here. Does grow along with kochia, so sometimes it's been a little harder for us to detect it over the years because we've usually thought the weedy kochia was the problem, but we've never been able to cause any of these problems with the weedy kochia like we've been able to repeat in their lab with the salvia. And so it's a liver toxin, so it does some serious damage to the liver and kills animals pretty quick. So when we first come across this was just a few years ago, and what happened is a cattle producer out of Colorado kind of ran out of feed that winter. So he was looking around for feed and really couldn't find any hay. So he called up a producer up near Riverton, Wyoming, and he put up a lot of hay. And so that year he had this fresh cutting, and that's all he had left. And the livestock producer asked him, says, I need some hay. And he's like, well, I was just gonna get rid of this because it does have a lot of weeds in it. And the livestock producer says, well, that's all right. I've got to have something to feed. I got to keep my animals alive through the winter. And so he went and bought it, and they shipped it to him, and he fed a couple bales that first day, and he had a lot of animals start dying on him, and it was pretty quick. And so right after that, he told us, you can have this hay. He had over 220 bales that were delivered to him. He says, you guys can have it to do research. So we brought it back to the lab, and we sampled all these bales, and the chemistry, we kind of looked at it from a chemistry aspect, and our chemists run all these samples, and he saw that about 17 of the bales had less than 1% contamination. About 140 of those bales had 1 to 25%. 47 had 25 to 50, and then over 50% in contamination in about 7 of the bales. And so you can see one of the bales we've opened up, and you could see that there's just a lot of the salvia spread out through this bale. There was a lot of it in there. And so that guy, the livestock producer, he lost 170 cows over just a couple days out of a herd of about 500. So that's a pretty catastrophic loss for you to have that happen. And so that kind of, unfortunately for what he had happen, led to some more research for us, and then led, our chemists worked through this plant and kind of determined the toxins that were in it. There's a couple, salverin's one of them, and that was pretty toxic. They do liver damage, so kill the animals pretty quick. And so we've also, because of this research, we've gone on and we've found that there's been a couple older cases that we've determined that were caused by this that we didn't know at the time, just because we didn't know that the salvia caused the problem. Another plant that causes problem is local weeds. And so local weeds, there's both astragalus and oxytropis species, and they have to contain the toxin swainsinine to be considered a local weed. There are some astragalus species that accumulate selenium and also nitrotoxins. So they're not really local weeds, but they can poison animals. So you can see there's a large distribution of local weeds throughout the Western US. And usually some of the signs are weight loss. So this wasting disease, you can see, a lot of these animals starting to waste away, get this aberrant behavior. So that's where we kind of get this locoed animal, crazy animal, a local weed problem. Also causes reproductive dysfunction. Animals may not breed. You get some deformities and offspring. And then animals that are up on higher elevation mountain sites can get this brisket disease that's also associated with it. So the swainsinine is produced by an endophyte, and not all local weed plants have this endophyte. So the local weed plant itself doesn't produce a swainsinine, but this endophyte, if it's associated with a plant, it produces the endophyte. So not all astragalus and oxytropis species have the endophyte, so not all of them have the swainsinine in it. So a population in your pasture, most of those plants are going to have the endophyte, so they're going to have swainsinine, but you'll have a small percentage of that population that doesn't produce a swainsinine. But if you have the plant there, it's probably going to be a problem. Oxytropis species are usually a long-lived perennial, so you see these less apparent population cycles. The astragalus species, they're a little shorter lived, and they usually depend on fall and spring precipitation, and then you can get these big outbreaks. So you could go a number of years without having any of the local weeds present, and then just get the right precipitation and have a big outbreak. The seed coats on these plants are pretty hard, and so the seeds stay viable in the soil for 50 plus years. So you can go a number of years without having a problem, and then have a big outbreak in the right conditions. So some of the recommendations to reduce losses, avoid grazing during pregnancy. One thing is if you could do some intermittent grazing. So a lot of these plants we've talked about are acute poisonings. So just a couple little grazing bouts and you lose animals, but local weeds are more of a chronic. So they have to consume the plant 2 to 3 weeks before you start to see problems. So if you see animals starting to eat local weed, if you have some clean pastures that don't have local weed, and then you can rotate them off the local weed and let that toxin kind of clear the system before you start seeing a lot of damage to the animal, then you can be safe to graze it at times. Breeding males should be off for at least 90 days before they start to breed. And then sometimes you can get some permanent neurological disorders, and a lot of those animals you just don't want to keep within your herd. Horses can be pretty affected by it, and so a horse that has these neurological disorders, it's recommended not to even keep them. especially as animals that you would dare ride. So there's some other plants like halogeton and greasewood that contain oxalates. That's a toxin in them. Halogeton usually grows in these disturbed areas like on roadsides or trails or near watering troughs. And so it's pretty lethal to sheep. But if you can get sheep or cattle that'll kind of graze it slowly for the first few days, their rumen bacteria can condition to it. And so they can consume a little more before they're poisoned. So it helps them kind of increase the tolerance to it. It does kill the animal pretty quick. And usually what we see with sheep is we've seen large sheep losses in the past. We don't see it much anymore. But usually what happens is people bring hungry animals in and unload them in an area that has a lot of halogeton. And halogeton kind of grows up in areas where a lot of the other plants aren't very palatable. And so they will go to that green halogeton pretty quick, and it can cause some poisonings pretty quick and some pretty big death losses. There's a number of plants that accumulate nitrates. And some of the factors that are associated with that are fertilization, and then weather patterns. So droughts or frosts can increase the nitrates. And then weeds that grow in barnyards that, maybe there's a lot of fecal matter in the barnyard. And so they can kind of uptake those nitrates out of that, the weeds will. And then the nitrates are usually highest before flowering. We'll occasionally get calls on nitrate poisoning, but it's not a big issue anymore. Just occasionally some losses that occur. And so some of the common causes of problems is usually hungry animals and animals that are in poor body condition score. So we like to say if you can keep your animals in good body condition score and don't turn them out when they're hungry on new range lands. Animals that are hungry are less selective in what they eat. So that's usually when you see a lot of poisoning cases. So this was a picture he took up near Kingman, northern Arizona. So, not much growing out there. So there's a little patch of plants out there somewhere, they're going to eat them no matter what it is, as long as it was green. So this one, we had some death losses due to what's fiddleneck, an Absentia species, and it causes liver damage. And what happened is in the sand washes in this area, it would start to grow, and that cattle were hungry, didn't have anything to eat, so they would kind of go right to it. So that's kind of what I have. Looks like I stayed on time, didn't go over. So
Perfect. Clint, thank you. So we do have time for a few questions, and while those are, and you folks just unmute your mic and speak up.
I've got a question for Clint.
yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious if wildlife avoid these poisonous plants. I've had producers ask me, like, how do elk not know to eat this? Or do other animals die as easily as livestock from any of the poisonous plant species?
It's a great question. So we have had some reports, or we've been contacted a number of times kind of about the wildlife issue. We don't see it a lot, like the larkspur. Why don't they eat larkspur? They're always grazing in the areas where larkspur is, but we don't seem to see losses with larkspur, whether they're more resistant to it or not. But we have had some calls kind of up in northern Nevada where they suspect that they've eaten some plants like death camas and had some losses. We've had some big losses here in the Salt Lake area this last couple winters, where elk have come in and they've eaten the Japanese yew, which people are growing as an ornamental in their yards. And so the animals are coming into town and they're grazing those ornamentals because there's a lot of snow up in the mountains. And so we do get reports occasionally, but for the most part, we don't get a lot of calls on that. See, Matthew has a question.
Yes, what is your outlook for the poisonous plant population for this year? Are you expecting more or less?
It kind of depends where you're at. You know, usually if you've gotten a lot of moisture, you're going to have a lot of problems. Usually if you're drier, you don't have so many problems. But if it's there, you do have more problems because you have less other available forage. So it's a big if question. That's a hard question to answer. And it's one of those that a lot of times it depends where you're at.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Clint, why don't you talk a little bit about your proposed webinar or symposium at the 2025 meeting in Spokane?
Yeah, so we're kind of thinking of bringing a few scientists up and just doing like a 2 or 3 hour symposium, hoping to get some producers there. And larkspur is always a big problem up in that area there around Spokane. There's a lot of problems with crooked calf syndrome, so we want to kind of go over that. We're just kind of wondering what topics you think might be of interest to get people there and get producers there. Do you have anything you might know of? We'll probably talk about pine needle abortions because that's usually that can be a problem up in that area. So we want to kind of focus around the Pacific Northwest area and maybe answer any questions that people are seeing with problems.
Well, thank you. I see your contact information, both email and phone number. And so this webinar is recorded. It'll be available for people. And I think when I post the notice of the recording, which goes on the pnwsrm.org webpage, I'll include your contact information just with a request for people to contact you if they have specific poisonous plants that they're interested in for this symposium.
Okay. Yeah. Be glad to
Any
hear
further
from you.
questions?
I've got one more question.
Yes.
I'm curious if Tordon has been used or tried out on any control of these plants and if it has been effective or not.
Yeah, there has been some work done. I think the larkspurs, the tall larkspurs, there's been some work. I guess the big concern is you got to worry about other vegetation. You know, a lot of times it's hard to spray areas that have the tall larkspur because they're usually up on Forest Service land. So the Forest Service, they are a native plant, and the Forest Service really doesn't want you to spray in native plants. So it can be an issue with that, but we have had some producers that have said they have personnel in the Forest Service that are willing to work with them and have been able to treat some plots, but that's the big issue. But yeah, there has been some work, but yeah, Tordon's one we kind of try to stay away from.
Thank you.
Yep.
And one more call, last question. Dr. Stonecipher, thank you very much. This was a fascinating webinar, and we appreciate your sharing your expertise and your experience with us today.
Yes. Thanks for inviting me.
And folks, you can watch for the recording. We'll post a notice of it at the PNWSRM website. Also, the recording will go on our YouTube channel. So you would search for the Washington Chapter Society for Range Management, and you'll see a listing of all of our quarterly presentations. Thanks to you all for joining us. Good day.
Thanks.